Well, what do you know? We hit episode number 300. It's kind of amazing to me. That represents 6 years of doing this podcast, and I am so glad to be able to share this episode with you and to share the whole run of it. This week we're having a very special guest. I was actually invited into the studio by Andrew Baschyn of Baschyn Musik. And we had a very interesting discussion about his work. He's approaching 30 years of music making, which seemed to be a great tie-in with the 300th podcast. So I really thought it was a great matchup. I hope that you enjoy this. If you're not familiar with Andrew's work or the work of Baschyn Musik, you may want to do a little searching around. In the show notes, we have some links for you to follow. Otherwise, I think there's a SoundClick site that you can check out. But in any case, I hope that you enjoy this. And I also want to take the opportunity to remind people that this podcast is funded through Patreon only. You can do something at patreon.com/DarwinGrosse. That's DarwinGrosse. I really want to thank all the people that have chipped in already. We had a great group of people kick it off, and I really do appreciate it. But with that, and with no further ado, let's jump in. Okay, so today I'm getting a chance to do an in-person interview. I'm going to be speaking with Andrew Baschyn, who does work under the name Baschyn Musik, or just Baschyn. And you'll find his stuff online, but I think a bunch more is about to come out. He's working on doing some release work as well, so very excited about that. But without any further ado, let me just say hello to Andrew. Hey, man, how's it going?
Good. How you doing? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for opening your studio to me to come in here. It's really an amazing opportunity to just kind of sit here. I have actually seen a lot of people who've been working in here and stuff, and so it's kind of a special moment for me. Why don't we start off by having you tell the listeners a little bit about your work?
Well, I've started producing or dabbling in electronic music as a late teenager. I started in 1990, and back then it was, there weren't a whole lot of schools for it, so you're kind of on your own how to figure it out. And I was lucky enough to be in the Chicago area where there were plenty of studios, and I had just moved back to Iowa after high school and would work 2 jobs and then end up going to the city and go to the studio maybe once every 2-3 months when I could afford it.
And what kind of music were you doing then?
Pretty much the same thing as I'm doing now. It's electronic music, but it's always been sampler and sequencer based. I love drum machines, but it's just the sampler and the sequencer and a mixing board that kind of got me started. And I obviously had an engineer the first couple of years, so I kind of learned from him. But I was pretty much just using the sequencer and sampler, their Emulator III,
right.
At that point, and very early digital mixers and processors.
Sure. Now, you have worked in kind of a couple of different working groups. Probably the most well-known is Autonomous, right?
Correct.
What is that work? And so your work with Bobby on that, it actually spanned a fairly long time, if I'm checking my history right.
Yeah, basically at the end of 96 we did what everyone else does in Minneapolis. You put an ad in City Pages. and I was specifically looking for a guitar player along the Slow Dive My Bloody Valentine curve.
Oh, sure.
And I met Shane Kramer. So he came in October of 96. And then we kind of monkeyed around. I think you had mentioned a long song that you enjoyed that we had done. That was probably done in November of 96. And then in January, we took an ad out for a vocalist. And we were literally running female vocalists out every 15 minutes from the duplex I lived behind Orfolk on 26 and Lindale.
Okay.
So we were literally running girls out every 15 minutes. And somehow Bobby just had it, and it was like, it's chemistry. People always forget it's chemistry. And she particularly had a voice that we couldn't bury, because a lot of those shoegaze bands slash the vocals are kind of in the background a little bit more than normal pop or typical voices. So that kind of changed the sound because you couldn't bury her voice.
Right. Yeah, it's a very unique voice, and so I was listening to the double album. I actually had it playing on the car on the way over here. It's amazing because it kind of is almost a classical, sort of like housey female voice.
Yeah.
But you actually laid a lot of different kind of musical play behind it, and it was amazing because regardless of what you were slotting in behind it, it always seemed to just fit nicely. And I think that's got to be hard when you're when you're pulling a collaborator in to do that.
Yeah, a lot of the songs started with me and Shane, and obviously the guitar and bass samples were done actually on that Emulator 3 there.
Okay.
And it was just, we didn't have a lot of gear, so it was basically the Emulator 3 sampling parts and arranging them, and then we'd pass them off to Bobby in the mini disc days. You buy yourself a mini disc player so you can keep shoving ideas across the table.
Right.
And a lot of those songs were just ideas that she had the intuition to make songs out of them, because some of those songs aren't that complicated. And it just kind of takes a good storyteller to kind of pull the actual structure of the song together when there really sometimes wasn't a whole lot of structure.
So for that work, most of it was really coming out of the Emulator 3 with her voice over the top?
Almost everything, all the albums you probably heard, and up until probably 2005.
Okay. I
tell people it's the Emulator 3, and then it would just be in, out, through to 8 other synthesizers, and when we go into the studio, it would just be, sometimes it'd be laying up against a wall, MIDI chaining
right.
the rest of the synths, and it would just all go in at one time, and then we'd stack the vocals and the guitars and the harp or violin. But for the most part, the second album that you heard, that was all done on a 4-track.
Oh, really?
So it's Emulator 3, the Tascam 644 4-track, which I still have in the other room.
Oh, wow.
But it was kind of like it's an 8-channel mixer, 4-track cassette.
Right.
But you'd fill up the mixer, take left, right, put the guitar on it, bounce it to DAT, and then bring the DAT back carefully, and then you'd free up 2 more tracks for voice and harmony.
Right. Sure.
So it was really, sometimes I look back, I'm like, I don't even know who that person was that did that, because it was just so much limitations, but we actually pulled it off.
Well, the one thing that kind of work did, though, that really forced you to think about the structure of the song while you were working on it, rather than waiting to sort of like rearrange it after the fact, right? You end up having to do all your breaks and all your song structure had to all be kind of predefined ahead of time.
Yeah, and she had come from a project that was, a recording project, so she knew how the studio worked. Mm-hmm. But in all honesty, I think it was a little bit a lack of experience and knowledge that I didn't want to overdub.
Okay.
So, and I kind of made the joke that, if you can't sing it all the way through now, I mean, how do we take it to the stage? And it was purely just me being lazy, and I don't want to punch in and punch out, because I'm like, I barely know how to use the thing as it is.
Well, and punching was never fun on those kind of
No, but she was, a star in that sense that there was no autocorrect either.
Yeah,
it was just a SM58, no compressor, no nothing, and still have the same effects processor we used back then, and I still enjoy it.
That's wild. It's amazing. And it's interesting that everything went into a 644 because, first of all, I had a 644 back in the day, and I actually loved it because I had Porta Studios before that, but I always thought that the mixers were real problems in those early machines. Mm-hmm. And I felt like that mixer on the 644 was pretty adept for being what it was. And it recorded pretty well. Now, what's interesting, though, is we see a lot of people kind of going back to tape as if that's kind of a holy grail and something's missing. Do you ever pull it out and try using it anymore, or are those days done for
No,
you?
absolutely. That's why it's literally, there's another studio in the other room, but that kind of has the older gear in it, and the 644 is still there.
Oh, yeah.
And obviously the tapes are long in storage, safely, climate, but, we'll probably end up pulling some of that just to get it digitized, because I'm now surrounded by people who know way more about the history and how things are going to pan out with that kind of media, that they want to start pulling all that stuff from the DATs, the mini disc, the 4-tracks, you're talking the first album of the double that's Black ADAT.
Oh,
so there's just 2 of them.
Oh, jeez.
And he had the little standalone locator thing. Mm-hmm. I think it was an 01R, the first Yamaha, I believe.
Okay.
So that first album was done there, but then, I kind of, over time, it's interesting that some of the songs that I kind of favor were actually done on the 4-track for some reason. I don't know why.
Well, I would say that one of the things that was really true of the tape time frame, the tape, because it kind of had its own heavy hand, it actually did a nice job of blending things for you. And so blended mixes tended to be, I don't know, seem more kind of sonically glued together in some way.
But just for the simple fact that you can roll off the effect with the return and or crank the pre on the channel itself and just flood the mix slowly.
Right.
And like at the end of the song, like you want that big gated reverb sound. I mean, it's kind of funny that sometimes you can't do it on newer boards, and the more you find out from other people, it's like that really was an interesting mixer for that period.
Right. Yeah, so true. So true. Now, one of the things I like doing in my podcast is finding out how people got to be the artists that they are. How did you get into music? How did you decide on electronic music? And who were the people that were influential early on to get you into it? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I guess even going back to even grade school, in early junior high days, when rock was kind of rock, I kind of liked the songs that had synthesizers in it, like Journey and like, Styx, Keyboard was here, like those more heavy, or Asia, those more heavily. I didn't really know what that sound was, but I kind of knew I liked it. And you're talking, I was like in Iowa at this point, so there wasn't MTV yet, and there wasn't, you
weren't going down the street to see someone use a sampler either. Right.
So, and then obviously we moved to the northern part of Illinois, North Chicago area, probably about the middle of '84. And to this day, I joke about to my parents, we moved on, I think it was July 27th of 1984. And that was a day that I had tickets to Van Halen's. but we moved to Illinois that day. But as a consolation, my mom took me and my sister to the Thompson Twins, and Berlin opened.
Oh, wow.
At Poplar Creek. And that was kind of the period where synthesizer music was kind of becoming more and more accessible on the stations. And luckily we were on the lake way up on the North Shore, that if you get close enough to the lake, you could get WNUR, out of Chicago, the college station, because it didn't carry very far.
Right.
And that kind of helped shape what you listen to. But, like you said, what inspired you and got into that, it's like you go to the newsstand and get #1 magazine from the Britain, publication, and then you go to the record store that was called Strawberry Fields, and you order those records. You didn't really know what you're getting into.
Right.
But then that kind of, opened the floodgate, and then of course you get the driver's license, you pile your friends in, and then you start going to wax tracks.
Right.
And that's where it all started.
Cracked open, yeah. Well, but at that time, a lot of what would have been happening in Chicago would have also been pretty industrial oriented, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was in the drum section in junior high, so that would have been '84, and we had just moved there, and after school, one of the drummers lived across the street, and we'd go over, and he'd play the UTFO battle records, and like Roxanne, and those records, and I didn't really know what that was, but it was just interesting that is kind of when I was, introduced to hip hop and what kind of became that little sector of, urban music, because we were exposed to everything.
Right.
I tell people, like, in Chicagoland, there was Medusas and there was McGreevy's. They're called juice bars back in the day. You go to McGreevy's on Friday, Medusa's on Saturday. If you're under 21, you got till like 11:30 to kick you out. But it was never the alcohol or the drugs. It was just the pure love of music.
Sure.
And that's where you got exposed to everything. You'd have the hip hop room with electro and the Spanish high energy, they called it back in the day, or which is not freestyle. And then in the other room, you'd have more like, Wax Tracks, New Order, those types of sounds. And it just, it's like everyone just kind of blended together.
You just like threw me back there mentioning the high energy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't even really like thought of that as a phrase for a long time, but Jesus, that was like, I remember you'd go in a room where that was blaring and it was just like, holy crap, this is like alien and so freaking exciting, right?
Yeah.
That's what must have been really interesting being in that area, because Chicago was one of those places where it really was a musical melting pot. You had a lot of different things going on simultaneously, and it wasn't necessarily always on purely like racial barriers either.
Right.
It was sort of like a free-for-all, and so much cross-pollination between genres that ended up developing brand new genres out of the thing.
Yeah, because like when I was, I probably had the weird hair and all that other stuff, and the makeup, and so people were always kind of like, you must listen to cool music,
right? Right.
And then I became friends with some of the people, just what kind of music you like, and like, hey, I DJ. So then a couple of Puerto Rican boys are like, we want you to come over and bring your records. We didn't know each other really.
Yeah, right.
But I went over there, and like, so then that's when I started to DJ, because I don't know, you probably remember, I can't tell you one song he sends, but they were like, Noel was really big. Had the high energy, artist, but but it just kind of, like you said, it just kind of worked. They played their electro records, freestyle records, and then I had Dig It by Skinny Puppy, and they just loved they loved the beginning of that drum beat. So I bought a second copy so they could go back and forth between that.
Right.
But that's the beauty of it. We're all, there's such a weird ethnic, melting pot, like you said, but it was just so much more freedom and less ego or anything. It was just, obviously teenage years are very, formative, but it was like music would always made people, get those friendships or those connections. And
you kind of talked about like getting started with stuff, but there's obviously some place between starting to DJ a little bit and then ending up at an Emulator 3. What's the through connection there that occurred for you?
Well, I was lucky enough that my parents, we had piano lessons and then violin lessons briefly, and then drum lessons. But of course, with drum lessons, you have to start on the practice pad and this and that. And then, eventually, the more electronic music I listened to is like, I'm like, Twitch had come out. And I remember Music Center, I think it's still there in Kenosha. The music store. Yeah. I took Twitch into there, and I go, well, I'm like, with my dad, I'm like, well, what? I want to make music like this. And they said, that's called a sampler, son. and they directed me towards the Prophet 2000 keyboard.
Oh, wow, okay.
And my dad's like, we're not spending that kind of money on, you have a Pearl export series, you're not even playing anymore.
Yeah.
But that was kind of when I decided that, eventually I'm going to get to that point. And then, of course, a couple of years later, I figured out the hard way. You got to work 2 jobs and spend $400 a day in a studio and then hope you get something out of it.
Yeah. So you literally like bootstrapped yourself by just like working to get studio money and then banging it out. Yeah,
because like, after, high school, I told my parents, don't waste your money on college because that's just not for me. And but at that point, when you're back in the middle of Iowa, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I'm like, maybe pick up a second job and start figuring this out. And they have the reader, like we have the CD pages, and one of the studios, Chicago Rehearsal Complex on South Prairie by McCormick Place, they listed they had an Emulator 3 in the whatever ad they were, talking about.
Right.
And we just talked about this a couple of days ago. I think the reason why that gravitated towards me is because I didn't know anything about E-mu, but I just knew I'd been seeing Depeche Mode since '86, since the Black Celebration tour, and this is now 1990. So I think that branding of them with E-mu, like, well, if it's good enough for Depeche Mode, it's good enough for me.
Sure.
And just going to the local stores back then, the Emulator 2s were still in the store, but I think that's probably the connection where I decided where
that was where what you were going to take on.
Yeah, and then obviously it's like, why am I spending X amount of money? Maybe I can get my own.
Right.
And then in '91, right before I moved to Minnesota, it was one of this cute little girl, hey, can you help me fill out this credit application for GAN Music? And then they were dumb enough to finance me for 5 years on an Emulator 3.
Oh my goodness.
And I remember I was so cheap. I'm like, well, I'm staying in Kenosha, so let's just ship it over the border so I don't have to pay tax on it.
Yeah.
But I guess that's when I kind of figured out that, all right, now I don't have an engineer to show me how to use this. I have to figure this out.
Sure. Wow. So prior to that, then you were kind of depending on other people to do the technology part, and you were just focusing on the music?
No, this is just me by myself in the studio in Chicago, and I had an engineer, but I'd always I think the Southside song you might have listened to, that was just little snippets of sounds in the emulator, and I had to tell him what little teeny tiny part I wanted, so he had to go in and edit that stuff, and then I had to arrange it and like do that.
Oh, interesting.
And then there's like a weird distortion that happens on the 2 in that song, and the highway wraps around the Lakeshore Drive at that point, so we were getting a lot of CB noise. So then all of a sudden, the song you heard, there's like a 45-minute version of that where because like there's just you pick up these weird frequencies.
Right.
And I'm like, no, don't retake it. I want that.
Yeah, it's excellent stuff, right? Yeah. Oh, that's hilarious. That's, man. You're just reminding me. I mean, I know this intellectually. But just talking about this is reminding me how crude some of the things were that we had to do in order to get stuff out of our heads, right? I mean, early sampling stuff, the Emulator 3 is cool, but I remember cutting tape. I certainly remember doing bounces on ADATs and stuff to try and pull things together. I mean, it's some of the crudeness of that now. It's like, I don't think I could put up with that. Right. I don't think I would have the patience to deal with that in order to make that sound.
Maybe it's my age, but I told people with so many distractions and so much information in your hand or your pocket, back in those days you went to work, you found time to make music,
right.
You found time to hang out with a girl, and it was a lot less distraction, so you kind of had a lot more free time, and boredom sets in, so I'm like, I might as well figure this out.
Right.
And that first, the Emulator 3, the one I got was only 4 megs. There's a 4 meg version and an 8 meg version.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one I had only had 4 megs of sample, memory in it, so you really had to be particular on like what you wanted, and I think that's why I bounced into MIDI quickly after that I told people it's probably the world's most expensive drum machine for me, because I just takes individual drum hits and use synths and other things to fill out the song, because after a while you just ran out of sample memory.
Sure. So what would you be using for sequencing then?
Oh, the emulator.
Just a built-in.
Yep, 16 track sequencer.
Wow. So you never went Wow, that's amazing. But I guess I can imagine it. I've known people who have started off that way, and there's something about when you do that first thing that you learn in depth, you start thinking in those ways then, right? Mm-hmm. That's how you imagine building up a track. Is that kind of how it felt for you?
Yeah, and I guess you just kind of have that weird feeling of like, is this going to work or is it not going to work? And after a while you kind of know it is going to work, but with the 16 track sequencer, I mean, literally up until 2005, I used that thing, and it was temperamental, and it's obviously healthy now, but at that point I went to the MPC 2000 XL, which is still the same thing. It's still a sampler and a sequencer.
Right. Yeah.
And I still to this day have never used computers for much of anything.
That's interesting because, well, and so I'm here in your studio, and it is refreshingly computer free. What is the point at which you actually move to digitize stuff, or do you let somebody else deal with it?
No, we at this point we obviously got the Toft in within the last year. So what we do now is we kind of fill up the 24 tracks, and my phenomenal tech goes, hey, you got that Tascam, 38. Let's get that up and running. And then, of course, he explained, because I'm by far not a great engineer, I mean, enough to get going, but he goes, let's just start busing the 8 out of the Toft
into the Tascam.
Right. And then the Tascam is 8 channels or 8 tracks, and then those 8 tracks will dump down into the Apogee because that has 8 in, and then it will go into Logic. But for the most part, it's pretty much Logic is a glorified tape recorder.
Yeah, right. Okay, got it. So you don't, that's interesting. Well, again, what it does, though, it implies that you have carried forward this idea of how you do sequencing and how you do song structure and stuff. It's kind of the same, it has been the same all along.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Now, you talk about, and I noticed the MPC is in a fairly prominent part of your studio here. Is that kind of your work central? Is that where you're sequencing out of now?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like we, with 2 in, 2 out. It's kind of like, one mono bass, one poly synth to kind of get the ideas going.
Sure. Okay.
And then, you can keep going the in out through if you want. And then when you get to that point, obviously Logic and the MPC are locked, so then they can go in, and then you can start, when I work with Faith, she is such a great, player. Faith Escola.
Okay.
So, and, we can get stuff into the box that way, and then she can go ahead and play freehand keys over. She's a phenomenal player in violin or whatever else she wants to put in it.
Okay.
So then that kind of, but it's like I tell her, we just always have to be locked.
Right.
So, but that's, and even when I play live, it's like the MPC, mute mode, that kind of makes you a little bit more experimental, and it will never be the same show twice because you got X amount of pads to work with, you got X amount of drums in there, just kind of wing it.
Yeah. It's funny because I know for myself, I tried really hard to embrace things like the Octatrack and some of these other things that represented sort of like a new version of that kind of sequencing. But I would always find myself being like, where's the equivalent of the mute mode on the MPC? Because once you get used to sort of like real-time playing of your sequence like that, it's a very unique and very powerful way to work, I think.
Yeah, and when we were, really, hitting it hard live, it's like we would, just, when you link all your sequences together and your segments, I tell them, we're starting at sequence 88, we got to go to 99, and you just sit there, how terrifying it is. You just start rolling, next sequence, then you can go back into mute mode, next sequence, and you really have to be...
You have to be on top of it.
Right.
Yeah. So true. Now, one of the things that's interesting to me is that all of our discussion about song development and about recording and stuff has all been about sampling and sequencing. But here in this room, I see a tremendous amount of analog gear. At what point did the analog stuff start speaking to you? And how does this relate? When I listen to some of your older music, there seemed to be like a time period where you were kind of really drawn into sort of the techno of the time, and I would say even kind of Midwest style techno. And to me, that had a very analogish sound, right? Yeah. And then you kind of embraced the electro and the more sample oriented form at some point. And it seems like you kind of go back and forth. What does the analog stuff mean to you? How do you use that in conjunction with these sampling tools? And then how do you take something like that and play live with it?
Well, I guess when we're talking sampling, it's the sampling is, the drum machines are always sampled into the MPC or the emulator. I've never sampled anyone else. I remember probably remember the days where there were sample CDs and like, we didn't ever go down that rabbit hole. But, so everything for me has always been the drum machines are individually hit into the sampler.
Okay.
And then after that, it's pretty much, the analogs have always been there. And, when I had the money, that was, early 20s, it was like a 106.
Okay.
And then after that, a JX8P. And then after that, I bought the first Virus. And for some reason, I didn't particularly care for it. And then, but Guitar Center's like, well, you only get store credit. So then back in the day of Future Music, you just read reviews and read what's coming out. And the Pulse was being released.
Oh, yeah.
And then that Pulse is still obviously my main go-to for bass. But it's like I told people, like, it took me probably decades to figure out that I was always kind of analog. I didn't even realize it, aside from the JD 990, which the digital stuff you probably hear in the earlier stuff.
Yeah.
The only digital I ever really used was the 990.
Oh, really? That's interesting. I had a JD 800, which is just a keyboard version of the same thing. I thought that was a phenomenal piece, and it's interesting. You still see like serious players still have them in their rigs because it had a very unique sound.
Yeah, and you had to do your math because with the parts and the polyphony.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So, and of course, years later, there's a 800 somewhere around here, but it really was. It was, you didn't really realize that that was right before the analog emulation and virtual analog came out. I mean, it was like when the JP8000 came out, that kind of pretty much changed the game.
Changed the game, yeah.
Because the Nord Lead one was obviously technically the first one, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And but I've never really been into digital synths for some reason. There's some laying around here, but I'm like, I don't know what it is. It's always been analog for some reason.
And so, do you ever do sound design on the analog gear and pipe that and sample that?
Oh yeah, even to the point where there's analog effects pretty much on the console. So, when you start experimenting with that, doing a dual spring reverb, when you got the SBF chorus flanger from Roland, I tell people that's the beauty of MIDI. You can just walk around and change a MIDI channel and just keep going, and then that's where you kind of find that sound, as long as it's playing the same thing, you can go find different layers and different ways of using effects where if you're committed right away, you kind of like commit, go on, where I'm more of a slow,
play around.
Right.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. So you say you're mostly analog, although I will say the one thing that I see probably quantity-wise most in this room is Waldorf gear. And Waldorf is kind of a funny thing because for most of their life, they, at the very least, no matter how digital they were, they kind of always had analog filters for a lot of it, or the filters were close attempts to be analog-ish. Is that what allows sort of them to be part of your mix, or is there something historically important to you about the Waldorf stuff? What's the Waldorf dance?
People like a certain brand, they kind of give it a shot. Mm-hmm. And, I tell people, 9 times out of 10, a lot of the stuff that's in this room really wasn't by design. It just kind of fell into your lap.
Right.
Or a Craigslist thing or whatever else. But, the pulses were definitely by design, because I think at one point someone said you could link 4 of them together to make a
polysynth,
and
right?
so of course you had to have 4 of them. Have I ever done it? No. So, but I mean, there's something warm and dirty about them for some reason. I think that's why they have that distinct sound.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You just mentioning the pulse is like I was working at Nova Music in Milwaukee back in the day, and I remember when the Pulse came out, I was like, we had a pretty good deal with their distributor, so we got them fairly early. And the Pulse came in, I was like, I don't know, I don't normally like those matrix programming things, but I'm going to give it a shot. I plugged it in, and I had some nice Genelecs at the time, and I just hit that first bass line, and I was like, holy hell. that had such a unique sound for the time. And, you know, the store had sold a lot of virtual analog stuff, right? And it was like, yeah, okay, clear difference, right?
Right.
It was a very clear winning move on Waldorf's part, I think.
Yeah, and like I said, when I got it, I didn't really know what I was getting into. But like I said, with limited information out there, you really,
Right.
you know, whatever you read in Future Music or you heard from a friend, you really, you know, I was surprised the Guitar Center even had it, honestly.
Right.
But then I got the Pulse Plus, luckily, so you could filter
me
in.
too, right.
But probably almost like most things that have been done in the last, almost 30 years, you know, the Pulse has been around, since maybe 80 or 96, 95?
95 maybe, yeah.
Yeah, because like even when low end wasn't really the norm, you know, I always had that really low subby low end that I would always get from the Pulse. So it kind of became, you know, part of your brand was just that's your go-to.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that the Midwest at that time frame was kind of known for was its sort of rave party scene. Were you ever involved in that much?
I wish I could say I was that cool, but I wasn't.
Yeah, I hear you.
You know, I think I went to...
You actually kind of like are more into it now maybe than you were then, because you've been involved in the further stuff recently, right?
I think when they rebooted Further in 16. Yeah. And but yeah, there was just... I kind of just never really got into that scene. I bought drop bass records.
Yeah.
But it was, you know, I think it's just because we were just in Chicago, we clubs.
Yeah.
You know, and it was just, you know, going at that point. I remember reading, you know, fantasizing about going to Europe because you had DJ Magazine and Mix Mag, you used to see all these things, and then everyone was worried about people, you know, dehydrating and dying. I remember, I remember
E-scare.
Yeah,
right?
But you know, I never really. I think I went to one rave here. I'll never forget that they had the 1200s on cinder blocks.
Right.
And I think Woody was at that one. It was over near Central and Broadway. But I think that was the only one I ever went to. Outside the very first show we ever did was at a rave, and we were like, we do not. This is not.
It's not your scene.
No, they don't. They ain't gonna dig this.
Right. Interesting. Well, because again, when I kind of listen to the broad range of music, there's some of it that would really fit into that world at that time frame. I think, you know.
Yeah, but I think at that point, you know, I didn't really have a whole lot of friends that were into that.
Right.
So I mean, you know, we were more into like, you know, indie rock and that type of stuff, because even when Autonomous started playing in Minneapolis, and I think me and Radke were talking about it, you know, when they were doing their thing, you know, we were kind of by ourselves because there wasn't really any electronic projects to play with. And you know, in the mid 90s here, you know, there were a big DJ scene, obviously, and stuff, but there weren't really a whole lot of electronic projects. And then if you think about it, you know, I think we had like Red Groovy and some other things but there weren't really any bands playing in clubs.
That's true. Yeah, right. That's a good point. Right.
And then, you know, but then it was like, you know, when Korg released those first three Electribes, that kind of, and the MC303 came out, you know, I remember someone came up to me at a show, was like, oh, I want to make electronic music, what should I start with? I'm like, get an MC303, because they just come out, they're pretty cheap compared to other things, and I think that's when you started seeing more and more electronic projects come out, is when the 303 came out, the MC303 came out, and the three Electribes came out. It was like bam, and it was great, because it's like, you know, you had to buy it. Yeah. And it wasn't cheap. Right.
But it was like, I remember the MC303 especially, it was one of those things where you could get it, and even if you were fairly a neophyte, you could get credible sounds out of it, and it would give you it would do that thing that's so hard with learning instruments or whatever, is you would actually get like credible results before you got sick of it and quit, right?
Right.
And I think that's kind of a key with a lot of instruments, is making it so that it's approachable enough so that you can really have fun and do something that you think is cool before you get so frustrated that you just walk away, you know.
Right, because I think after the Pulse, the next big purchase was the 309, the Revolution.
Right.
And that was, which, you know, obviously I think predated the MC303 as being the first groove box, but the bass was interesting in it, but it just, I think it's because I was used to the Pulse. It just never had the oomph on the low end.
Yeah.
But
it had kind of that squeaky filter on it too, which is a little bit odd. But also, that was also a time when people really started getting focused on like train spotting gear, right? And so since quasi MIDI wasn't something that a lot of people knew about.
Well, the name, I think the name killed it for him.
Yeah, maybe so. Revolution.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that didn't help. But you know, that was also a time when sort of the vintage thing and the collection thing started happening. Now, I'm curious because you have an extraordinary collection of instruments. I think people can occasionally see when people come and work in your studio or whatever, they see sort of like the racks of stuff. It's amazing. Right now, this looks like it could be a museum, and it looks like it probably would cost a museum's worth to get it. How did you build a collection like this? Creating a collection of gear at this point is really tough. Are you just sort of like a guy who never sells anything?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You're that guy.
Yeah. So, and now that I used to have won a couple of them.
Right.
No, but yeah, I mean, you know, the last couple of years, it's like, you know, I don't really buy new things. I think the newest thing I bought was, you know, the Model D when it got, you know, when it got MIDI'd.
Right.
And before that, I think it was 2015. They sent me one of the first Prophet 6s.
Okay.
And I remember where I had to, you know, play the fine line, headline the fine line. And I was used to the 106 and the MPC. That's all I go out with, the MPC and the 106, because that was just kind of easy, and it did it for me.
It sounded great, yeah.
And then I remember I'm like, well, all the MIDI data is the same. So I had a quick scramble for 2 days to get the Prophet 6 to where I wanted it, because obviously never use, stock sounds. You have to make your own, in my mind. But it just spoke to me, and like I tell people, like, that hasn't left the desk since it got here. So, but yeah, most of the stuff just kind of, it's either, hey, you want to trade, or nothing really. And most of the stuff I never really went out and had to say I wanted that.
Yeah, interesting.
Like, you know, I walked into a music around in Chicago, and they had the Prophet 5. And I think it's like only $1,700.
Oh, wow.
And this was probably, you know, maybe 2007, 6. So they still were climbing high.
Climbing up, yeah. By then.
But I remember it came with the Prophet remote.
Oh,
so then I went home, and I'm like, well, I don't know where this remote's supposed to connect to. And then I went on Vintage Synth, and I'm like, oh, I have a Rev 2. And I didn't realize that the Rev 2 was the one you wanted anyway.
Yeah, right, from a sound standpoint, right.
So, and it's interesting because it has a little music store that was a rental in Chicago on Lincoln, and it probably spent its whole life in Chicago.
Yeah.
But it's just, this is one of those things that, you know, your lady, hey, is your credit card clear? I got you. No, I don't got you. But yeah, I mean, it was like, you know, I mean, but yeah, it's, you know, when people always talk about the Prophet 5 and the OB8, they are very good complements to each other.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You know, and it's like my buddy worked at Guitar Center, you know, in the corporate side, and they're blowing the polyvolvers out. Mm. So I'm like, do you give me all the box ones you got? Because I get them at cost. So then I had 3 polyvolvers that were boxed. And then my buddy is like, hey, I want a polyvolver. I'm like, okay. He goes,
what swap? Right.
So then he put the OB8 on the table, and then
nice.
I put the polyvolver on it, and I think some DX7s or something. Those are the how you trade and have fun.
Yeah. Yeah, right. That's interesting because you're coming to it without a lot of desire. Mm-hmm. It actually gives you the ability to be a lot more flexible about trying things and taking advantage of opportunities when they come, right?
Yeah, like I remember I walked into Guitar Center, and they just got a TI in used, and like the guy's like, I'll give you a really good deal on it. I'm like, well, I didn't like the first.
Not that into it, but
I'm like, at this price, why not?
Yeah.
And then a couple of years later, my buddy's like, I kind of want a TI. I'll trade you the Prophet VS.
Oh wow!
So then that's how I got the Prophet VS. But it was just like, what do you got? Okay,
yeah, that's interesting. That's a neat way to go. But that also does put you in a great position. And also, I mean, there is sort of the reputation of when something comes into the studio, it never is going to see it again, never going to leave again, right. Which is kind of a great opportunity then, because the other thing that gives you the ability to do, you really honor the history of the work that you've done. And so to a certain extent, by still having all these instruments, if you wanted to recreate or even extend something that you did a while ago, you probably have the instrumentation to do it, right?
Yeah, everything. My way of thinking is if it's documented in a track, it's not going anywhere.
Right.
Either a guitar pedal or a rack effects unit or a synth or a drum machine. I mean, it's one of those things that, maybe it's the pack rat in me, but it's just one of those things that, like you said, like if I have to go back, it's always going to be there.
Yeah, the way to do it, right. So unfortunately, our time is almost done, and boy, I had a bunch of other stuff I want to do. One thing I want to ask, though, given that we're in the studio of plenty, when you come and you just want to have fun, you want to make music for you, maybe you had a hard day, or maybe something pissed you off, and you just want to make yourself happy, what do you turn on?
The Emulator 3.
Really?
Yeah.
Still to this day? Wow, that's awesome. That's cool. Well, it certainly does have a prime place in your studio. Front and center.
It's only because the power supply just got replaced, so now it's back up and running.
Ready to roll again.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Cool. So what have you got coming up in the future? We've been talking, and you're actually kind of working on pulling together some of your older material for re-release, right?
Yeah, I think next year will be the 30-year anniversary of me doing this, which makes me feel old, but most of the autonomous stuff will be coming out, and then me and Faith's project will probably be coming out, and of course the Baschyn stuff will be coming out individually with guest remixers on vinyl. So then it'll be like it'll be the old days. It'll be like one original track and 3 remixers from all over the world, just to bring that model back.
That's cool. That's great. But you had some remixing done of some of your some of your tracks, and I just thought it was really, I think it might have been an autonomous track even, that you had a really nice remix done.
Alexander East did one that came out on vinyl.
Yeah. That was really an amazing remix, and that had to kind of like make you want more.
Yeah, he's a dear friend, and I'm sure we're going to run out of time, but even how he made that remix, he got a mini disc of just Bobby's voice, and he didn't really know how the song went. But then he just blared it in his ears, he said, and he figured out the hook was "Wash It Away," because his daughter was younger at the time, because she was bopping around the house doing "Wash It Away." So then that's, he used the Moog Realistic, the
MG1.
And an ASR 10. And he played all the bass guitar. Such a talented guy, Alexander East. He played everything into a 4-track mini disc. I forgot they even made a 4-track mini disc.
Yeah, right. I know.
But that's where that remix came from. And everyone's like, well, even if you go on YouTube, I mean, that song hit so hard on YouTube. I'm like, I don't know why. And I don't know if it's because the mini disc compressed it a certain way, and it's the vinyl version of it. But it's just weird that was one of the last things that Autonomous did. But it was just, it was one of those things that everything was in the right place at the right time. It just
clicked, yeah, indeed, really. Well, great. I'll put some information on the show notes for people who want to check out some of your work. But for people who want to know more about Baschyn Musik or Autonomous or whatever, what's the best place for them to go? I mean, because a lot of the work that you did was in that weird spot where it was kind of like post-magazine, pre-internet, and so it's kind of, there's not a lot of documentation to be had.
Probably the Baschyn Instagram for now, and then that will probably lead into you know how it is. There's so many moving parts to get the next chapter going. Right. And I'm like, I ask people, like, you know, because you know how it is. You got a mixer, you got a master, you got this guy, that guy. You know, I mean, that's why I tell you have to have a village. And I'm fortunate to have a village, but the village is now, what's the next chapter? And so that's why just Instagram seems to be where everyone's at these days.
It does. It's amazing. Yeah. All right, great. Well, we'll make sure that we send people over there. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat, for kind of talking through all this stuff. It was a really interesting view inside your head and your process. I love that stuff. So that was really cool, man.
I enjoyed.
All right, thanks. Some very interesting stuff. Thanks so much to Andrew for having the chat. I was like sitting in the middle of his studio getting a chance to look at that gorgeous Emulator 3, which was like a 16-bit sampler with analog filters, a beautiful sounding thing, and really it makes sense why that would be the heart of your studio if you were into it. But also the MPCs, the tons of sequential gear. It was pretty impressive. And analog all the time, everywhere. It was really awesome. So if you have a chance, please make sure that you get out there and check out some of the Baschyn Musik work. His work under the name Autonomous, which is what a lot of his kind of like mid-time frame work would be. It's a very odd thing, the way that his career spans sort of like the end of print and the beginning of the internet. So some of the stuff might be hard to find, but it's still worth tracking down just to get a sense of the history of the thing. I want to thank you, the listeners, for continuing to support me by listening, by showing up every week and checking out the podcast. I want to especially thank the Patreon contributors who are the sole financial support for this podcast. And with that, I want to wish you a farewell for this week. Thanks so much for helping me make 300 of these things happen. We'll catch you later. Bye.